The neighborhood was quiet and tidy, with streets lined with neat houses and well-kept lawns. Every morning, the sun would shine through the trees, casting shadows on the sidewalks where kids rode their bikes and dogs ran around freely. Life seemed peaceful and predictable. People waved at each other when they passed, and the mailman knew almost every resident by name. It was the kind of place where everyone followed the rules, not because they had to, but because they wanted to be part of a community that respected each other. Among these neighbors lived someone who tried very hard to stay unnoticed. He liked quiet mornings with coffee on the porch and evenings spent reading in peace. He had moved to this neighborhood for that very reason, hoping to find a little corner of calm away from the chaos of his work life. Life had been calm for months. He spent his days working at his job, which was demanding but rewarding. In the evenings, he would sometimes play soft music, just enough to fill the empty spaces of his house. He was careful not to disturb anyone. Yet, he had learned early on that even the smallest things could upset some neighbors. Most people were friendly and considerate, but there was always someone who watched a little too closely. In this neighborhood, that someone had a name that soon became infamous among the residents: Karen. Karen lived a few houses down. She had a tendency to be overly concerned with rules, noticing things that most people would ignore. She could spot a crooked fence or a slightly unkempt flower bed from half a block away. She carried herself with an air of authority and never hesitated to point out when others were not following the standards she thought everyone should uphold. At first, her actions were minor and almost amusing. She would leave polite notes about garden maintenance or mailbox colors, things that could be fixed easily. The protagonist, wanting to maintain peace, would follow through quietly, adjusting a plant here or straightening a flag there. He never wanted conflict. He liked being friendly, but also valued his privacy. A delicate balance in any community at first. Karen's notes were simply a reminder to maintain the neighborhood's appearance. She once left a note suggesting that the bushes in front of his house were too tall and blocked the sidewalk. He smiled when he read it, trimming the bushes that weekend without saying a word. In return, Karen nodded politely when they passed each other on the street, asked, as if satisfied that he had corrected the minor infraction. Life went on. He thought he had understood her nature, a little intense but harmless. However, as weeks passed, her attentiveness to rules started to feel less. It's like a simple concern for the neighborhood and more like surveillance. It started with small observations. Karen would be seen walking slowly along the street, clipboard in hand, jotting down notes while glancing at his house. He tried not to take it personally. Perhaps she was just a dedicated member of the Homeowners Association. He respected that in a way. He had seen her attend meetings and speak passionately about maintaining order, and it seemed she genuinely cared. Yet, there was an intensity in her gaze, something that went beyond typical neighborly concern. It made him uncomfortable. He began to notice that even minor activities, like taking out the trash or hanging laundry to dry, were somehow under her scrutiny one morning. He stepped outside to get the newspaper and noticed Karen standing near his driveway. She held a folder and looked very serious. He waved, but she didn't return the gesture. Instead, she pointed toward a corner of the lawn, indicating something. He walked over and realized that one of the flowers near the edge of the lawn leaned slightly over the sidewalk. It was a trivial matter, barely noticeable. Yet Karen had apparently been observing every detail. He bent down, carefully adjusting the flower so it would stand upright. When he looked up, Karen was still there, watching him intently. He felt a little uneasy, but forced a polite smile. "All set?" he asked, trying to sound casual. Karen nodded slightly, then turned and walked away. It was an odd interaction, but he convinced himself it was nothing serious. Some people were just particular about appearances. However, the feeling of being watched lingered. He started noticing patterns in her behavior. She would appear at times when he least expected it, sometimes lingering near the entrance of the neighborhood to observe who was coming and going. He noticed that she always carried her phone, likely ready to document anything she deemed inappropriate. At first it was easy to dismiss as harmless overzealousness, but the more it happened, the more he began to feel the weight of her attention. Even social gatherings were not free from her watchful eyes. During a small block party, he noticed Karen moving through the crowd, subtly evaluating the placement of chairs and decorations. When someone accidentally left a cooler slightly out of place, she would approach with a comment about following the rules. While others laughed or ignored it, he observed quietly, noting the energy she brought into the event. It wasn't malicious yet, but it created tension. The party's lighthearted atmosphere was slightly altered by her presence. People were polite, but there was an unspoken awareness that Karen was always judging. Despite these growing discomforts, he continued to maintain his life calmly. He followed the rules where necessary, trimmed bushes on time, ensured that his driveway and porch were tidy, and avoided any confrontations. He valued harmony and did not want unnecessary conflicts. Most neighbors continued to respect boundaries, understanding the unspoken rules of coexistence. He occasionally thought about leaving a note of his own to Karen, something gentle and human, explaining that he was careful and considerate, but the thought never materialized. He believed in quiet resilience rather than confrontation. In the evenings, he would sit on the porch and reflect on the day. The sun would set slowly, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, and for a moment, everything felt normal again. He would watch kids playing, dogs running, and neighbors chatting in the fading light. Those moments reminded him why he had moved to this neighborhood. It was safe, peaceful, and offered a sense of belonging. Yet Karen's presence created a shadow that made even these calm moments slightly tense. He tried not to let it bother him, focusing instead on the things that mattered: peace, routine, and the small joys of life as days turned into weeks. He began noticing how others reacted to Karen. Some neighbors were wary, avoiding any conflicts with her. They nodded politely, smiled when necessary, and kept to themselves. A few whispered about her strict adherence to rules, but no one openly challenged her. He realized that, while he tried to ignore her behavior, it affected the entire community. Karen had created an environment of caution, where people second-guessed small actions and feared her disapproval. It was subtle, almost invisible, but powerful enough to change the rhythm of neighborhood life. Despite the tension, he maintained his quiet, disciplined approach to life. He continued his work, spent evenings with his books and music, kept his interactions with neighbors pleasant but limited. He hoped that Karen's attention would eventually fade, that her overzealous nature would find another outlet. Yet deep down, he sensed that she would not stop easily. There was something relentless about her personality, a need to assert control that went beyond simple community pride. One afternoon, while tending to his garden, he noticed her standing at the end of the street, watching carefully. She held a small notepad and jotted notes as she walked. He paused for a moment, considering whether to greet her. He decided against it, fearing that any engagement might escalate her attention. Instead, he focused on his garden, carefully planting flowers and arranging the small decorations he enjoyed. Karen's presence lingered in the periphery, constant reminder that his peaceful life was under observation. As the sun began to set, he retreated inside, locking the doors and drawing the curtains. He reflected on the day, noting how even ordinary tasks had become slightly stressful under her gaze. He reminded himself to stay calm, to maintain his routine, and to let patience guide his actions. It was a quiet struggle, one that required self-control and careful observation. While outwardly life seemed normal, there was an undercurrent of tension, a sense that the calm could be disrupted at any moment. Little did Karen know, the quiet man she was observing had a life and skills that went far beyond what anyone in the neighborhood could imagine. While she focused on the small details of fences and flowers, he had faced situations in his career that required calm, intelligence, and careful planning. Yet he never let that side of himself show. He lived quietly, blending into the neighborhood, all while understanding the power he held if provoked. For now, though, he remained patient, keeping his skills hidden and his life simple, waiting for the day when her overreach would meet the limits of his restraint. And so, the neighborhood continued its calm routine. Children played, neighbors waved, and the sun set each day with familiar beauty. But a quiet tension remained, a story unfolding silently between the observant neighbor and the one she scrutinized. The days ahead promised to test patience. reveal character, and ultimately show that sometimes those who appear ordinary are far more capable than anyone could ever expect. Days turned into weeks, and Karen's attention on the protagonist began to grow more direct. At first, it was small things that she noted in her careful watch, minor complaints that could easily be overlooked or adjusted. But over time, her behavior became harder to ignore. Every action he took seemed to catch her eye. She commented on the angle of his mailbox, the color of the paint on his shutters, and even the pattern of his garden stones. Each time she made a note or a suggestion, she seemed more insistent, more convinced that she was right and he was wrong. The protagonist noticed her persistence, but he stayed calm. He continued following neighborhood rules, making sure nothing could be genuinely criticized. Yet Karen's scrutiny didn't lessen. She found small imperfections that were invisible to others, as if she was searching for ways to assert control. One morning, he stepped outside to take out the trash and saw her across the street, observing the placement of the bins. She shook her head slightly, clearly disapproving, then wrote something in a small notebook she carried. The protagonist took a deep breath, reminding himself not to react. He calmly adjusted the bins, lining them up neatly, and returned inside. He felt the tension, but refused to let it control him. Soon, the notes Karen left became more pointed. One appeared on his doorstep, suggesting that his flowers were planted too close together and could obstruct the sidewalk in the future. Another criticized the way he trimmed the grass, claiming it was uneven. Even when he followed all the rules meticulously, she still found something to comment on. The protagonist started noticing that the other neighbors, who once seemed neutral, now avoided eye contact with him. Worried about being pulled into conflicts with Karen? One afternoon, as he was gardening, Karen walked by with her usual intensity. She stopped near his driveway and began speaking directly. Her voice carried a sharp edge, though she tried to appear reasonable. She asked why the bushes weren't trimmed in a certain pattern and why the flag on his porch wasn't centered perfectly. The protagonist smiled politely and explained that he had followed the guidelines given in the HOA handbook and that everything was compliant. Karen wasn't satisfied. She continued questioning him about details that seemed irrelevant, as if her purpose was to unsettle him rather than to maintain order. He remained patient, answering calmly and without irritation, hoping she would eventually move on. At the same time, he noticed that her behavior started to affect other aspects of life. His neighbors became more cautious, hesitant to act freely for fear of Karen's criticism. Conversations at the mailbox became awkward, with people lowering their voices when she approached. He realized that her obsession with rules created tension not just for him, but for the entire community. He understood that Karen wasn't just about neatness or appearance, she thrived on control. Making herself the authority over everything she observed, despite the growing annoyance, he maintained his daily routine. He walked his dog in the mornings, stopping only when necessary to acknowledge neighbors politely. He kept his car parked precisely within the lines of his driveway, and he made sure that even the smallest details of his property were in order. Still, Karen found reasons to criticize. One morning, he found a note on his car windshield, complaining about the angle of the tires when parked. The comment was absurd, yet he simply smiled, adjusted the tires slightly, and carried on. He refused to let her petty complaints disrupt his peace of mind, as her behavior intensified. She began documenting more than just appearances. Karen started showing up at HOA meetings with lists of supposed infractions, including some she had personally observed. She would stand during meetings, pointing out violations she claimed were detrimental to the community. Other residents whispered nervously, not wanting to challenge her, and the board seemed hesitant to confront her. The protagonist stayed silent during these events, listening carefully, noting her tactics without revealing any part of his own background. He understood that confrontation wasn't always about arguing. It was about staying composed and letting the situation unfold naturally. Karen also began attempting to involve the local authorities. She would call to report minor imagined violations, such as a sidewalk that might eventually crack, or a lawn that could possibly appear uneven from a distance. Each time the protagonist responded calmly, providing documentation or proof that everything was within regulations. Yet, she continued to escalate, It was as if she enjoyed the process itself, the act of asserting dominance and watching others react. One afternoon, he noticed her taking pictures of his property with her phone. At first, he considered confronting her, but he decided against it. Instead, he observed from a distance, letting her make her own assumptions about what she saw. He knew that reacting emotionally would only give her more satisfaction. Instead, he focused on his hobbies, his reading, and his music. He reminded himself that patience and self-control were more powerful than immediate reactions. Karen's overreach was growing, but he was confident that it would eventually reach a limit she wasn't prepared to face. The tension reached a subtle peak. One evening, when he was outside watering his plants, Karen appeared seemingly by chance, but he noticed the calculated way she observed him. She asked questions about his garden layout, the types of flowers he planted, and even commented on how he was using the hose. He responded politely, answering questions without adding any extra information. When she finally left, he reflected on the encounter. He realized that her obsession was not with rules themselves, but with control, with asserting power over others. Despite all this, he continued to act normal in the community. He attended neighborhood events, always polite and friendly, yet careful not to give her any reason to escalate further. He noticed that her constant monitoring created an invisible barrier, making social interactions delicate. People were cautious, careful not to upset her or draw attention. The protagonist understood that he had to maintain composure and never give her the satisfaction of seeing him flustered. His calmness became his shield, a quiet strength that Karen could not easily break. One day, he overheard neighbors whispering about Karen's behavior. Some were frustrated, others amused, but most were wary. They noticed how she seemed to focus on him specifically, and they discussed how unusual her obsession had become. The protagonist listened from a distance, understanding that people were aware of the situation, but afraid to intervene. It reinforced his belief that handling the matter quietly, without aggression, was the best approach. Confrontation could make things worse, especially with someone like Karen, as weeks passed. He began to plan subtle ways to document the interactions, purely to protect himself. He kept notes of encounters, photographed harmless incidents that might later be misrepresented, and remained meticulous in following rules. All the while, Karen continued her scrutiny, unaware that her actions were being quietly observed and recorded. The protagonist stayed calm, patient, and deliberate, understanding that the situation could escalate further, but confident that he was prepared to handle it if it did. Evenings were his sanctuary. After a long day of work and careful observation, he would sit on his porch, sip his coffee, and watch the neighborhood wind down. Kids returned home from play. Neighbors waved goodnight. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with warm colors. In these moments, he felt a sense of peace and control, reminding himself that the quiet, methodical approach he maintained was far stronger than Karen's impulsive actions. Karen's constant surveillance created an undercurrent of tension, but it also revealed something important to him. She was predictable. Every pattern, every action, every attempt at asserting control could be anticipated. He began to understand her methods, her timing, and the triggers that prompted her behavior. With each observation, he strengthened his own resolve and refined his strategies for remaining calm, composed, and undisturbed. The protagonist had learned to coexist with the chaos she created while protecting his own life and peace of mind. Every day, he reminded himself that patience and intelligence were far more effective than confrontation or anger. Karen's escalating attention was becoming a test of endurance, but he was ready to endure it without compromising his principles. He knew that at some point her actions would have limits, and he was prepared to act calmly and decisively when that day came. For now, he maintained his routine, observed her carefully, and let life continue at its steady pace. Karen's obsession with rules and control created tension in the neighborhood, but he was confident that quiet persistence, discipline, and careful planning would ultimately give him the advantage. The story of his interactions with Karen was far from over, and the coming days promised challenges that would test patience, restraint, and understanding. All while keeping life in the neighborhood as calm and normal as possible, despite the subtle storm brewing just beneath the surface. Karen's behavior had shifted from passive observation to active interference. She no longer just left notes or commented from across the street. She began showing up at times that seemed calculated, catching the protagonist in moments he would have preferred to spend quietly. One morning, he noticed her walking slowly past his house as he carried groceries inside. She stopped abruptly, squinted at his lawn, and made a remark about the way he had edged the grass along the walkway. Her tone was pointed, almost accusatory. He smiled politely and thanked her for the suggestion, then went inside, feeling the tension coil slightly in his chest. He knew her actions were no longer casual but deliberate, meant to unsettle. Over the next few weeks, her interference grew. She started approaching neighbors to question why he spent so much time tending to his garden, suggesting that he might be breaking HOA rules by doing too much or too little, depending on her whim. People began looking at him differently, not hostile, but cautious. Unsure of how much to reveal or share around Karen, she had created an invisible pressure, a web of scrutiny that seemed to touch every corner of his life. Despite this, he remained calm. He did not react emotionally. He observed and adapted. He realized that losing his composure would give her the satisfaction she was seeking. One afternoon, she took her interference further. She stepped onto his property under the pretense of checking the landscaping. He had been trimming some overgrown bushes when she approached, clipboard in hand, making comments about spacing and symmetry. He paused and politely explained that the layout was intentional and within HOA guidelines. She frowned, clearly dissatisfied, and began snapping photos. His patience was tested, but he stayed calm, knowing that a rash reaction could escalate the situation. Instead, he continued his work quietly, letting her take pictures while he focused on what mattered, maintaining composure and documenting the interaction for his own protection. Karen's escalation wasn't limited to property or aesthetics. She began attempting to control interactions, questioning him about trivial details in front of other neighbors. During a casual morning walk, she asked why he parked in a certain spot, why he walked his dog on a particular route, and even why he took certain paths through the neighborhood. Her questions were invasive, though disguised as concern for order and rules. He answered politely but minimally, giving nothing that could provoke an argument. Each encounter left him more aware of her persistence and the need to maintain a strategic calm. Even at neighborhood meetings, her influence had grown. She would stand during discussions, pointing out supposed infractions and asserting that her observations were correct. Other residents listened quietly, often nodding nervously, afraid of contradicting her. The protagonist remained seated, careful not to engage publicly. He understood that these public confrontations were her way of demonstrating power, and responding in kind would play into her hands. Instead, he took mental notes, analyzing her tactics and predicting her next moves. One day, Karen took an even bolder step. She began trespassing slightly. Stepping just onto his property to inspect a corner of his lawn she claimed was out of compliance. When he noticed, he calmly walked outside and stood at a distance, smiling politely. He reminded her gently that the area was within his property line and fully compliant with HOA rules. She hesitated for a moment, clearly taken aback, but she did not retreat immediately. Instead, she lingered, as if testing him. He maintained a composed stance, letting her realize that her actions were being watched and that he was in control of his reaction. After a tense minute, she finally stepped back, muttering something about wanting to ensure everything was proper. He returned inside, knowing that the encounter had subtly shifted the dynamic. His calmness had set a boundary she had not expected. The next escalation came in the form of digital communication. Karen started sending emails and messages to him, meticulously listing minor perceived violations. Some messages were polite, others carried a sharper tone, implying that failure to comply could have consequences. He responded consistently with evidence, photos, and references to HOA regulations, all written calmly and professionally. Despite his reasoned replies, she continued her barrage. He realized that her actions were now about control and influence rather than genuine concern for rules. Other neighbors began to notice the tension. Some whispered about her obsession, while others tried to maintain distance, wary of being drawn into conflicts. The protagonist understood the subtle dynamics at play. Karen's behavior affected not just him, but the entire community, altering how people interacted, how freely they moved, and how relaxed they felt. He remained a silent observer, learning from each interaction, noting her patterns, and planning his responses with care. The situation had become a delicate balance, requiring constant awareness and calmness. One evening, as he watered his garden, Karen appeared yet again. She had brought a measuring tape, ostensibly to check distances between flower beds. He greeted her politely and continued his task, aware that any hint of irritation could embolden her. She took measurements and muttered under her breath, apparently dissatisfied with the results. He offered gentle clarification where appropriate, always maintaining a calm and composed tone. By the time she left, he had quietly documented the encounter, noting her methods and timing. He understood that preparedness and observation were his best tools. Karen's next step was public confrontation. During a casual neighborhood gathering, she questioned the placement of decorations on his porch and the style of his garden ornaments. Other neighbors watched nervously, unsure how to react. He responded with calm explanations, showing that every detail was within HOA guidelines. Karen's face tightened in frustration as her attempts to unsettle him failed. He realized that his composed demeanor had a subtle power of its own. She could criticize and scrutinize, but she could not provoke an emotional reaction from him. That was a line she had not crossed and could not easily cross. Despite her persistent interference, he continued to live his life deliberately. He attended to his hobbies, engaged in quiet activities, and maintained positive interactions with neighbors. He understood the importance of not allowing Karen's behavior to dominate his daily existence. Every action was calculated to preserve peace, protect himself, and maintain normalcy. Even when she appeared unexpectedly or attempted to escalate her behavior, he responded with composure, patience, and strategic observation as Karen's tactics became more intrusive. He began noticing the patterns in her behavior more clearly. She had routines, certain times when she would appear, and specific triggers that prompted her overreach. By paying attention to these patterns, he learned to anticipate her moves, subtly positioning himself to maintain control without confrontation. He documented each incident quietly, noting times, locations, and specific behaviors. This quiet vigilance gave him confidence and a sense of security. Even as her presence remained a source of tension, her obsession with rules and control also revealed a psychological pattern. Karen thrived on asserting authority, gaining satisfaction from watching others respond to her scrutiny. He recognized that her behavior was more about power dynamics than genuine community concern. This insight allowed him to navigate interactions carefully, ensuring that he did not provide any emotional reactions or opportunities for her to feel triumphant. His calmness became a protective mechanism, a barrier that Karen could not easily penetrate. Through all these encounters, he remained human-centered in his approach. He understood that Karen's behavior stemmed from her personality and insecurities, not necessarily malice. By maintaining empathy while also protecting boundaries, he managed to interact politely without empowering her disruptive tendencies. This balance required constant attention, awareness, and restraint, but it allowed him to coexist with her without losing control of his own life. Evenings remained his refuge. After long days of subtle observation, careful responses, and strategic patience, he would sit on his porch, reflect, and plan for the days ahead. The sun setting over the quiet streets provided a sense of continuity and calm, reminding him that despite Karen's intrusion, life could still carry its natural rhythm. Children's laughter, dogs playing, and neighbors waving goodnight reinforced the importance of maintaining peace in his own actions. Regardless of external tension, Karen's overreach had become unmistakably clear, and the protagonist recognized that it would only escalate further if unchecked. He remained patient, understanding that timing and strategic calmness were crucial. He continued documenting interactions, observing patterns, and maintaining composure, knowing that the right moment to respond decisively might come at any time. By the end of part 3, the situation had reached a critical stage. Karen had crossed from passive monitoring to active interference, affecting both his personal life and the neighborhood dynamic. The protagonist had weathered these escalations with patience, strategic thinking, and composure. He understood the psychological patterns at play and had adapted to maintain control over his responses, keeping his life calm while observing Karen's increasingly disruptive behavior. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test boundaries, reveal capabilities, and ultimately define the limits of Karen's overreach. Karen had taken her scrutiny to a level that no one could ignore. She would appear at the protagonist's house unannounced, inspecting minor details as though she had the authority to dictate every aspect of his life. Her tone became sharper, more insistent, and less concerned with politeness or community guidance. The protagonist remained calm, aware that any overreaction would only feed her need for control. Instead, he continued to document her actions quietly, noting dates, times, and specific behaviors, all while maintaining his daily routines. One morning, Karen attempted to take her interference further than ever before. She stepped onto his property without asking, taking photographs of the patio and the garden. The protagonist, who had been reading in the sun, stood slowly and approached her with a calm smile. "Good morning," he said evenly. "Is there something I can help you with?" Her eyes narrowed, clearly annoyed that he had confronted her presence calmly. She began explaining her concerns about the placement of his decorations, but he interrupted gently, pointing out that everything was within HOA guidelines and that she was currently on private property. Karen froze, caught off guard. Most people would have reacted with anger or confrontation, but he remained composed, giving her the sense that her usual tactics were ineffective. After a moment, she stepped back, muttering something about making sure everything was proper. He nodded politely and returned to his reading, making it clear that he was in control of the situation. This small display of composure shifted the power dynamics subtly, and he knew that she would not easily forget it. The following days brought a tense calm. Karen continued to observe from a distance, perhaps reconsidering her approach, but her previous intensity lingered. The protagonist took advantage of this moment, maintaining his routines, engaging with neighbors politely, and ensuring that every aspect of his life in the community followed regulations. He documented incidents meticulously, capturing the context, details, and her intrusive behavior. His quiet, deliberate actions were preparing him for a future confrontation, should it become necessary. One afternoon, Karen's behavior crossed into overt aggression. She approached the protagonist while he was trimming hedges, speaking loudly and accusingly about minor issues that were clearly within regulations. She gestured as if she had the authority to enforce rules herself, ignoring the polite reminders that the HOA was the governing body, not her. The protagonist listened patiently, taking mental notes and maintaining a calm demeanor. Instead of arguing, he asked questions to clarify her concerns, subtly showing that her complaints lacked legal or procedural basis. This approach kept the interaction under control, demonstrating that calm intelligence could counter her aggression. The tension escalated further when Karen tried to involve other neighbors, encouraging them to question his actions and creating a subtle pressure campaign. Some neighbors were hesitant to engage, uncertain of how to handle her insistence. He remained neutral in his interactions, treating everyone with kindness and patience. His calm, methodical approach contrasted sharply with Karen's disruptive energy, and he began to notice that she was growing frustrated at her inability to provoke him. One evening, as he returned from a walk, he found Karen inspecting a corner of his property. She was taking measurements and notes, speaking under her breath about potential violations. He approached slowly, smiling, and said, "I've reviewed the HOA guidelines, and everything here is compliant. Is there something specific you'd like to discuss?" Karen's expression faltered. For the first time, she seemed uncertain. He continued calmly, explaining that all procedures had been followed and that any further complaints should go through the proper channels. Her usual confidence wavered under his composed and knowledgeable response. She stepped back, muttering about checking with the HOA, and left. This encounter marked a turning point. He had demonstrated that her usual tactics of intimidation and overreach would no longer be effective. The protagonist used this turning point to strengthen his position. He organized his documentation, creating a record of her interference, times she had trespassed, and repeated attempts to control his life. He maintained daily routines and engaged with neighbors positively, all while quietly reinforcing boundaries. Karen's frustration grew as she realized that her attempts to unsettle him were consistently met with calm, rational responses. Her overreach had met its match, and he knew it was only a matter of time before her behavior would face consequences. The next escalation came when Karen attempted a direct confrontation at a neighborhood meeting. She brought her notes and photographs, intending to publicly accuse him of violations. He remained seated, listening calmly, analyzing her tactics. When she presented her case, he responded politely but firmly, referencing the HOA guidelines, providing documentation, and calmly explaining that her accusations were unfounded. Her face showed visible frustration as her attempts to sway the crowd failed. Other neighbors, witnessing his calm and rational approach, began to see her behavior for what it was: overzealous, obsessive, and unreasonable. Karen left the meeting visibly upset, her aura of control shaken. The protagonist had handled the situation without aggression, humiliation, or drama. His calm intelligence had neutralized her attempts to dominate the interaction. He understood that her next moves might be desperate, as her sense of authority had been challenged in a public setting for the first time. He remained alert, ready to maintain composure and enforce boundaries if necessary. Days later, Karen escalated further by attempting to manipulate local authorities. She called to report minor perceived violations, citing photographs she had taken during her inspections. The protagonist responded with complete transparency, providing evidence that all actions were compliant with regulations. Despite her attempts, the authorities found nothing actionable. Karen's repeated failures and his consistent calm handling of the situation left her increasingly frustrated and unsure of how to proceed. One afternoon, she arrived at his property, clearly determined to push boundaries further. She stepped onto the lawn and began pointing out minor issues, expecting the usual reaction of irritation or apology. Instead, he calmly stepped outside, smiling, and said, "I've documented all of these areas, and everything is within compliance. It seems we have different interpretations, but I'm confident the HOA guidelines support my approach." Her expression faltered. She muttered something about double-checking and left quickly. The encounter reinforced his control over the situation and highlighted that her usual tactics no longer held power over him. Throughout this period, he maintained a human-centered perspective. He understood Karen's behavior stemmed from her personality and desire for control rather than malice. By remaining calm, composed, and rational, he protected himself without escalating conflict unnecessarily. He continued engaging positively with neighbors, maintaining daily routines, and focusing on the aspects of life that mattered to him: peace, stability, and subtle observation. Evenings remained his sanctuary. After days of careful documentation and strategic interactions, he would sit on his porch, sip his coffee, and watch the neighborhood wind down. Children's laughter, dogs running, and neighbors waving reminded him that despite Karen's overreach, life could continue at its natural rhythm. He reflected on the psychological dynamics at play, noting how calm intelligence could counter aggression and control. Karen's frustration grew with each failed attempt to unsettle him. She could criticize, scrutinize, and attempt to manipulate others, but she could not provoke an emotional reaction from him. His patience, observation, and methodical approach had neutralized her tactics. He continued to quietly document every interaction, anticipating the moment when he might need to reveal his true capabilities to prevent further overreach. The story reached a critical moment when Karen made her boldest move yet. She crossed onto his property with the clear intention of escalating the confrontation. Believing that her authority would dominate the situation, he calmly approached, maintaining a composed stance, and for the first time, he subtly revealed a hint of his professional experience. Without aggression, he explained the seriousness of trespassing and harassment, showing that her actions had legal and personal consequences. Her eyes widened in shock. For the first time, she realized that she had underestimated him. His calm, composed demeanor carried the weight of authority, and it was clear that her overreach had limits she had not anticipated. Karen stepped back, visibly shaken, realizing that she had pushed too far. The protagonist remained calm, letting the moment settle, showing her that he had control of the situation without escalating conflict. This encounter marked the turning point where his patience and composed strategy began to pay off, neutralizing her attempts at domination and restoring a sense of balance to his life in the neighborhood. From that day forward, Karen's interference diminished. She observed from a distance, her previous intensity tempered by the understanding that her usual tactics no longer held sway. The protagonist continued his daily routines, engaged with neighbors kindly, and maintained careful documentation. His calm intelligence had neutralized her aggression and restored the neighborhood's rhythm. The stage was set for a final resolution, where the lessons of patience, composure, and strategic thinking would fully manifest, showing that even the quietest individuals can command respect and control when necessary. The neighborhood had settled into a quieter rhythm after the last confrontation. Karen's intensity had noticeably decreased, though she still observed from a distance. Her confidence in her ability to control the protagonist had been shaken, and he could sense the subtle changes in her behavior. People began to interact more freely again, feeling a sense of relief as the invisible tension that had been in the air slowly lifted. The protagonist remained calm, patient, and human-centered in his approach, ensuring that peace returned not only for himself, but for the entire neighborhood. Despite the calmer atmosphere, he stayed vigilant. He knew that Karen's personality meant that she could try to assert control again if given the opportunity. He maintained his routines, engaging with neighbors warmly and consistently, while documenting minor incidents for his own records. This careful approach allowed him to remain prepared without creating unnecessary drama or tension. The neighborhood's daily life returned to a comfortable balance, with children playing freely, neighbors waving, and a sense of normalcy settling in. One morning, Karen attempted a small test. She walked slowly past his house, glancing at the windows and lawn with her usual critical eye. He stepped outside casually, smiling and waving, engaging in polite conversation. She noticed his composed demeanor, the absence of irritation, and the calm confidence in his presence. Without confrontation or drama, he set the tone, showing her that her attempts to unsettle him were ineffective. She muttered something under her breath and continued walking. Clearly unsettled by his calm and friendly approach, the protagonist understood the psychological dynamic at play. Karen thrived on provoking reactions, creating subtle tension and asserting control. By refusing to provide those reactions, by maintaining calm and rational engagement, he had shifted the power dynamic. Her behavior was no longer intimidating. It had become predictable and manageable. He continued to focus on what mattered to him, maintaining his home, enjoying daily routines, and engaging positively with neighbors. Community interactions slowly returned to a natural state. Neighbors began organizing small gatherings, block events, and casual conversations without fear of intervention. The protagonist participated where appropriate, always kind and approachable, demonstrating that life could proceed harmoniously despite previous disruptions. People who had been hesitant to speak openly began to regain confidence, realizing that Karen's influence had limits and that the calm, composed presence of the protagonist had restored balance. Karen herself seemed to acknowledge, at least subconsciously, the change. She no longer attempted aggressive confrontations or invasive observations. Her approach became more distant, cautious, and hesitant. The protagonist continued to document interactions subtly, ensuring he had records if any further escalation occurred. Yet, he did not use these records aggressively. They were a tool for preparedness, not conflict. His patience, intelligence, and composed demeanor had created an environment where control, not aggression, prevailed. In the following weeks, a pivotal moment occurred. Karen attempted a direct confrontation with a minor complaint, hoping to reassert authority. She approached him at his porch, clipboard in hand, ready to point out a perceived violation. He greeted her warmly, calmly explaining that everything was in compliance with HOA rules and suggesting that future concerns could be addressed through official channels. She paused, hesitated, and for the first time showed visible uncertainty. The usual confidence and dominance she wielded were absent. Her frustration and inability to provoke him highlighted the effectiveness of his consistent calm and strategic approach. She walked away quietly, leaving him to enjoy the peace he had carefully maintained. The neighborhood's atmosphere shifted noticeably. Karen's previous influence had waned, and neighbors began to regain trust and confidence. Casual conversations resumed. Children played freely. Everyday life continued without the tension that had hung over the community for months. The protagonist continued his daily routines with quiet satisfaction. Observing how his composed and human-centered approach had restored harmony,